It was 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and the 42nd floor of Callaway Tower had been empty for 2 hours. Daniel Marsh knew the building's rhythms the way a sailor knows weather. The cleaning crew clocked out at 10. The last of the analysts left by 11. Security ran its final sweep at 11:30 and settled into the lobby booth until morning. After that, the floors belonged to him, the buffer zone between the last of the corporate world and the first of the night. He was pushing his cart past the frosted glass panels of the executive suite when the wheel caught on a seam in the tile. The mop handle swung wide, clipped the door handle, and the door to the CEO's office swung inward with a low and weightless sigh. He didn't push it. He didn't try the handle. It simply opened. The way certain things open when you aren't looking for them. Daniel stood in the hallway and looked at the gap of darkness beyond the door. He should have pulled it shut and moved on. He knew that. He had a daughter to think about. A lease renewal in 6 weeks. And a man in his position did not walk into a CEO's office uninvited, not at midnight. Not ever. He was about to pull the door closed when he saw the light. A thin bar of green, low on the far wall, a digital readout, and below it, the unmistakable gap of a safe door that had not been closed all the way. He heard his daughter's voice in his head, the way he always did in moments like this. Not a memory exactly, more like a compass bearing. What if someone needs help, Dad? He stepped inside. Daniel Marsh was 34 years old, 5'11", and almost entirely invisible. This was not an accident. Invisibility, he had learned, was the primary occupational skill of anyone who cleaned floors for a living in a building full of people who were paid to think. You moved quietly. You finished quickly. You kept your eyes on the baseboards and the corners and the undersides of desks where people left things they didn't want to carry home. You did not make eye contact in the elevator. You did not have opinions. You were, as far as the 42nd floor was concerned, a function rather than a person. The function arrived at 9:30 p.m. and departed between midnight and 1, depending on the scope of the evening. The function wore navy pants and a gray shirt with an embroidered logo on the left breast. The function had a cart, mop, bucket, trash bags, a caddy of cleaning supplies organized by type, which the function had reorganized when it first arrived because the previous arrangement made no sense and inefficiency was its own kind of failure. The function had a name. The people on the 42nd floor didn't know it. The few who had looked at his badge in the elevator had looked away before they finished reading. He had been doing this job for 2 years and 4 months. Before that, he had spent 6 years in the Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 desk assignment in Georgia he didn't talk about. He had come home at 28 with a moderate hearing loss in his left ear, a collection of skills that didn't translate cleanly to civilian resumes, and a daughter who was 3 years old and did not yet know that her mother wasn't coming back. The hearing loss was better in his right ear. He had learned to position himself accordingly in rooms. He had learned a great many small adjustments of this kind, the accumulated workarounds of a man who had decided that adaptation was more useful than complaint. Sophie was 8 now. She had her mother's cheekbones and Daniel's stubbornness and a habit of asking questions that required him to think before answering. She had her mother's name on her birth certificate as a middle name, Claire. She knew this. She had asked about it when she was 6, and Daniel had told her the truth, in the plain way he told her most truths. Her mother had loved her before Sophie was old enough to know what love looked like, and had left not because of anything Sophie had done but because of something in herself she couldn't fix. Sophie had thought about this for a while, and then asked if they could have grilled cheese for dinner. He had said yes. They had. The subject had not come up again in the way it might have. Sophie seemed to have filed it in a category of things that were real and had been addressed and did not require continuous reopening. He envied her that, sometimes, he paid Mrs. Caldwell next door $20 a night to sit with Sophie while he worked the overnight shift. Mrs. Caldwell was 71 and watched police procedurals until she fell asleep in the recliner. And Sophie had twice let herself in at midnight to find the old woman snoring through the closing credits. Daniel had never found a better arrangement. He had stopped looking for one. The job paid $19.50 an hour. With the night differential, It came to just over $40,000 a year, enough for the apartment in Garfield Heights, enough for Sophie's school supplies and the occasional pizza on Friday, not enough to breathe freely, not enough to stop calculating. He kept a spreadsheet, not on a computer, on paper, a habit from years of working in environments where digital records could be accessed by people you didn't trust. The spreadsheet showed income, fixed expenses, variable expenses, and a column at the right labeled margin that was rarely more than $200 a month. Some months it was negative. He had a savings account with $412 in it that he did not touch. He had seen the CEO of Callaway Group, Vanessa Holt, 3 times in person. Once in the lobby when her car was late, and she stood at the glass doors in a charcoal coat and said nothing to anyone for 11 minutes. Once in the elevator when she got on at the parking level and spent the ride to 42 reading something on her phone. Her presence filling the car, the way cold air fills a room when a window opens. And once, 6 weeks ago, at 10:15 on a Wednesday night, he had been collecting trash bags from the hallway receptacles when he passed the row of windows overlooking the street below. Her car was still in the executive bay. He recognized the black Lincoln. He looked down and saw her inside it, not on the phone, not reading, just sitting. And though the angle was steep and the light was poor, he could see the set of her shoulders, the way her head was bent forward. She was crying. He didn't look long. It wasn't his business. But the image had stayed with him, in the way certain images do not vivid, exactly, but present. The way a bruise is present even when you're not pressing on it. He had thought about it again on Thursday and on Friday, and had then made a deliberate effort to stop thinking about it on the grounds that it was none of his concern, and that the lives of the people he cleaned up after were systematically none of his concern, and that this was in fact a condition of the job rather than a failure of his attention. Vanessa Holt was 33 years old. She had been named CEO of Callaway Group 14 months ago, the youngest chief executive in the company's 60-year history. The financial press had called it bold. The analysts had called it risky. From what Daniel could gather from the headlines he caught in passing and the conversations he overheard in the break room, where his invisibility worked best, her first year had been rough, not catastrophically so. The company's numbers were stable, but there was a quality to the executive suite in the evenings that he had learned to read after 2 years of cleaning it. A residual tension in the rooms after everyone left, as though the air itself had been compressed by the weight of things said and unsaid. None of that was his concern. He was here to clean the floors. He told himself that, still standing in the open doorway to her office, looking at the safe. He did not touch the safe immediately. He stood inside the office with the door behind him and let his eyes adjust. The city pressed against the windows in its usual way, streetlight and distance. The slow migration of headlights 40 stories below. The office smelled of something dry and expensive. The desk was clean. The chairs around the small conference table near the window were perfectly aligned. Nothing out of order. Nothing that suggested haste or struggle. The safe was recessed into the wall behind a panel that had been left open. It was larger than he expected, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet. Steel-faced, digital keypad. The door was ajar by perhaps 2 inches, the green indicator light blinking slowly. He thought, she left in a hurry. He thought, this is not my business. He thought, if there's something in there that's dangerous, to her, or to anyone. He pulled the door open with the back of 2 fingers, touching only the edge. There was no cash. He hadn't expected cash, but its absence was still notable. Instead, 3 items. A manila envelope, thick and sealed with a metal clasp. A USB drive, unmarked, attached to a keyring with no other keys on it. And a photograph, printed on standard paper, folded once. He unfolded the photograph. 2 people stood outside what looked like a restaurant entrance, the kind of awning and signage that suggested a city, mid-range, somewhere Daniel didn't recognize. One of them was a man in his 60s, heavy-set, silver-haired, wearing a suit that was too good for the neighborhood. The other was a younger man, mid-30s, sharply dressed. The younger man was looking at the camera with the flat expression of someone who didn't know or didn't care that they were being photographed. Across the younger man's face, someone had drawn a red X in marker. Daniel stood very still. He replaced the photograph exactly as he had found it. He looked at the USB for a long moment. Then he looked at the door behind him, the hallway, the empty executive corridor. He picked up the USB and closed the safe. He did not know why he did it. He would spend the following 72 hours trying to articulate the reasoning and arrive at nothing satisfying. What he knew, standing in that office in the dark, was this. A photograph with a face crossed out inside a CEO's safe at midnight was not something he should leave untouched. It was either a threat being tracked or a threat being made. Either way, it was not something that should stay in an unlocked room until morning. He pocketed the USB, let the safe door fall back to its prior position, still ajar, green light still blinking, and walked out. He finished the floor. He mopped the executive corridor. He took his cart to the service elevator and rode down to the basement and clocked out at 12:44, same as any other night. He didn't sleep. He plugged the USB into his laptop at 1:30 a.m. while Sophie slept in the next room. It was not encrypted. That surprised him. Either it had been prepared quickly, or whoever assembled it had confidence in the physical security of the safe. Or, and this seemed increasingly likely as he opened the first file, it had been assembled by someone operating alone, without IT support, without an assistant, without anyone who could be told. There were 11 files. 4 were PDFs, 3 were video files. The rest were documents in formats he didn't recognize. He opened a PDF first. It was a financial ledger or something formatted to look like one covering a period from 7 years prior to 4 years prior. The names meant nothing to him, but the numbers were large, and the column labeled disbursements had entries that didn't correspond to anything in the receipts column. Someone had annotated the margins in a tight, precise hand. The handwriting was not Vanessa Holt's. He had seen her signature on building notices, a loose and angular script. This was someone else's notation. He opened the second PDF. More numbers. A series of wire transfers between entities whose names were Corporate Bland and interchangeable. Meridian Holdings, CG, Capital Partners, Vantage Allocations. None of it told him anything specific. All of it suggested, with the cumulative weight of 11 pages, that someone had been moving significant money in ways that required some effort to conceal. He opened the first video. It was a conference room. The camera angle suggested a phone or small device placed on a shelf. The frame was tight and slightly off-level. 4 men sat around a table. Daniel recognized the silver-haired man from the photograph immediately. The other 3 were older, heavier, with the particular physical authority of men who had spent decades in rooms where their word was final. There was no audio for the first 40 seconds. Then it came in sharply, mid-sentence. Can't sustain the current structure if she starts pulling threads. You understand that. Then we make sure she doesn't. How? A pause. Then the silver-haired man said something Daniel couldn't catch. The audio dropped again, but the man to his right nodded slowly, and Daniel felt a cold awareness move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He watched the second video. Then the third. By 3 a.m. he understood the broad shape of what he was looking at. Callaway Group had, in the years before Vanessa Holt's tenure, been steered by its board's senior faction into a series of financial arrangements that appeared, on their face, to be legitimate investment vehicles. What the annotated ledgers suggested, and what the video fragments confirmed, if you could follow the half-caught sentences, was that a significant portion of those arrangements had served to route money to individuals and entities connected to the board members themselves, not illegally, perhaps, if you had the right accountants, but in ways that would be devastating if made public. In ways that would certainly interest regulators and, very possibly, prosecutors. Vanessa Holt had inherited a company with a time bomb inside it, and someone, the men in that conference room, or people adjacent to them, wanted to ensure she never found the detonator. Daniel sat in his kitchen in the dark and thought about Sophie asleep in the next room. He thought about the red X on the photograph. He thought, I need to understand whose face that is. He took Sophie to school at 7:30. She was in 2nd grade and wore the same green jacket every day. and had recently become interested in bridges, how they were built, why some fell. She had 3 library books about it in her backpack, which made the bag too heavy for her slight frame, so she had to lean forward slightly when she walked, like someone heading into a wind. "You look tired," she said, when he crouched to zip her jacket at the school door. "I'm okay. You look like you did when you were thinking about whether to let me quit piano." He looked at her. "You remember that? You had the same face. All careful." He pulled her jacket straight and stood up. "Go learn something. I always learn something." She turned and walked through the doors, with the air of someone who had said exactly what needed saying, and was now done. He drove home. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he didn't drink, and thought about his options in the plain, sequential way his training had taught him to think. He had spent years in environments where good decisions and bad ones had consequences that were immediate and physical, and the habit of clarity had stayed with him, even when the stakes had contracted to the scale of ordinary civilian life. He laid the options out as though on a table. Option 1. Put the USB back. Walk into the building tonight. Find a way to return it to the safe. And forget the whole thing. The problem with this option was that the safe had been left open for a reason: haste, or distraction, or genuine emergency. If it was haste, the contents were something Vanessa Holt considered urgent. If it was distraction, something had thrown her off her routine in a way significant enough to make her forget standard security. Either way, putting it back felt less like solving the problem, and more like closing his eyes to it. There was also the practical reality. The safe's digital keypad would log entry events. Whether Vanessa checked those logs was unknown to him, but the kind of person who built a secure evidence file and photographed surveillance footage of board members was probably the kind of person who checked her access logs. Option 2. Turn it over to the police. He spent 15 minutes thinking seriously about this before dismissing it. The material on the USB was, at best, suggestive. The videos were partial, low quality, and lacked context. The financial documents required expertise he didn't have to interpret. Bringing this to a patrol officer would accomplish nothing. Bringing it to anyone higher up required connections and credibility that Daniel Marsh, janitor, 42nd floor, did not possess. He had no relationship with investigators or prosecutors. He had a name on a badge and a work schedule, and a daughter waiting for him at home. And those things did not open doors in the way that was needed here. Option 3. Go to Vanessa Holt directly. He held this thought for a long time. He turned it over. He looked at it from different angles. A man who cleans her floors had taken something from her safe. He had no credential, no standing, no reason to be believed. She had every reason to view him as a thief and a threat. She could have him arrested. She could have him fired. She could do that with a phone call right now, without any of this coming to a head. She was the CEO of a major corporation. He was the overnight cleaning staff. The power differential was not subtle. And yet, he thought about the annotated margins of the financial ledger, the handwriting careful and compressed, clearly working through something, building a case line by line the way you build a case when you don't have anyone to build it with you. He thought about the USB with no keyring, a person who carried this separately, deliberately, not attached to anything else that might be lost or found along with it. He thought about the photograph and the red X, which was not the mark of someone who was cavalier about threat. It was the mark of someone who understood exactly what they were dealing with, and was tracking it with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. But the face with the red X was sitting somewhere in his mind with a weight that wouldn't move. He thought about the photograph again, the younger man, sharply dressed, his flat expression, and the simple, irreducible fact that someone had put that image in a locked safe and marked it the way you mark something you're afraid of. He thought, she built this file herself. She's doing this alone. And then he thought, with a clarity that arrived not dramatically but quietly, the way most things became clear when you stopped fighting them. The reason she's doing it alone is because she can't trust anyone in that building. She has no allies. She's been in the role for 14 months, and she has been isolated from every resource that might help her. And whatever she has gathered at personal risk in an environment where the people who want to stop her have structural authority over most of the people who work for her. He was, technically, not one of the people who worked for her. He was contracted through a facilities company. His employment relationship was with them, not Callaway Group, which meant that whatever authority the board exercised over the building's staffing was one step removed from his employment. He thought, this is a very small thing. Then he thought, it's not nothing. That made his decision. He went back to the building the following afternoon not as an employee but as a man with a purpose, which felt strange on the 42nd floor. He wore the same clothes. He had his work badge. He took the service elevator and found the executive assistant's desk empty and Vanessa Holt's door closed. He knocked. A pause. Then, I have a 3 o'clock. It's Daniel Marsh. I work the overnight cleaning shift. I need 2 minutes. Another pause. Longer. The door opened. She was in the clothes she'd been wearing all day, a dark blazer. A white shirt that had lost its early morning precision, and she was looking at him the way people in her position look at unexpected things, with a stillness that was not quite calm. What do you want? He held up the USB. The stillness changed. It became something else, not panic, not rage. Something more controlled than either, and more frightening. Where did you get that? Your safe was open last night. The door to your office was open. I went in to check whether something was wrong. You went into my office. Your safe was standing open. I saw the photograph. He kept his voice level. I saw the X. She stepped back from the door. Not an invitation, more a recalibration. He understood it as one and came in, closing the door behind him. She didn't sit. She stood behind her desk with her arms at her sides. And he understood now, close up, what he had only sensed from 40 feet below. She was exhausted in the way that comes from sustained wariness, from months of looking over your shoulder, inside a building that is supposed to be yours. You plugged it in, she said. Yes. And you understand what's on it. Enough of it. She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look. He had been looked at in harder rooms than this by men with considerably more leverage. You could have sold it, she said, to any number of people who would pay well for it. I know. Why didn't you? He set the USB on the edge of her desk. Because I've seen what happens when information like that goes to the wrong person first, and because the person I work for, in the only sense that matters to me, is 8 years old and would never forgive me. Something shifted in her face. Not softness, exactly. More like recognition. The moment when you realize you have been looking at a person rather than a role. Her name is Sophie, he said. She thinks I have a careful face when I'm thinking about something hard. Vanessa Holt sat down. She told him, in the clipped, precise way of someone who had rehearsed this conversation with themselves many times but never intended to have it. The 3 men in the video were founding board members of Callaway Group. They had served on the board for an average of 22 years. When the previous CEO retired, they had voted to bring Vanessa in over 2 internal candidates, a move that had surprised the industry at the time, and that she now understood had been deliberate. She was 32, new, without allies in the boardroom. She would be easy to manage. What they hadn't accounted for was that she had spent her first 6 months in the role doing exactly what a young, inexperienced CEO was supposed to do. Reading every financial document in the company's archive she could access, every board resolution for the past decade, every subsidiary filing. The man in the photograph was named Curtis Webb. He was not a Callaway employee. He had no formal relationship with the company, but his name appeared, under various corporate structures, in the disbursement records Vanessa had assembled. He was the conduit. He was the mechanism through which the money moved. He became aware that I was looking, Vanessa said. 6 weeks ago, someone broke into my personal laptop. No data was taken. They just wanted me to know they could. Daniel said nothing. The X is mine, she said, a reminder of who I'm looking for. The drive is everything I've been able to compile. I keep a copy in the safe and one in a location outside the building. I was going to take both copies to the SEC next week. I had a meeting arranged. She paused. Then the board called an emergency session for Monday. They're moving to remove me on a performance basis. It's pretextual, but if they succeed before I can file, the new interim CEO will have full access to the archives. And any version of this story that gets told will be theirs to control. You need to file before Monday. I need to file before Friday. Their session is first thing Monday, which means they'll move Thursday evening to set the agenda, and at that point they can restrict my building access as a precaution. She looked at the USB on her desk. I have most of what I need, but the primary ledger has a 4-year gap I haven't been able to close. Without it, the SEC has suggestive evidence, and not proof. What fills the gap? Physical documents. Paper records from the era before the company went fully digital. They should be in the archive on sub-level 2. She looked at him steadily. I've had 2 different executive assistants try to pull them. Both were told the archive was closed for inventory. The building manager, who reports to the board facilities committee, controls access. Daniel turned this over. Sub-level 2, he said. I cleaned sub-level 2. For the first time, something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood of the face, crossed her expression. I know, she said. The archive was not dramatic. This was what struck him most when he finally pushed the door open Wednesday night. Not the gravity of it, but the ordinariness. Steel shelving in rows, cardboard banker's boxes, labeled in the dry shorthand of corporate record-keeping. Dust that had settled in a particular way, that told him exactly how long it had been since anyone came in here with a purpose. Vanessa had given him a list. Not written down, she had read it to him once, and he had committed it to the place in his memory that had held grid coordinates and radio frequencies a decade before. Box series prefixed BGM, spanning fiscal years from 14 through 17. Anything in the disbursement subcategory. He found the first series in the 3rd row. He worked methodically, the way he worked everything without urgency, which was the fastest way to work. He photographed each relevant page with his phone, making sure the light was even and the text legible. He found what Vanessa was looking for in the 5th box, a series of disbursement authorizations signed by board members, countersigned by an external accounting firm that had since dissolved, routing figures that corresponded to the gaps in her digital ledger. The paper trail was dense and technical, and he understood perhaps 15% of it. But he understood enough to recognize completion when he saw it. He was photographing the last page when the door opened. He didn't startle. He turned slowly, the way he had learned to turn when something unexpected happened. Calm first, assessment second. The building manager, Roy Hennessy, stood in the doorway. He was a thick man in his late 50s, with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen, and now it has. I thought I heard something down here, Hennessy said. Daniel held his phone at his side. Running late on the floor. Came in to check the HVAC unit in the back. HVAC's not your department. Found a water issue last week. Wanted to check the drain. Hennessy looked at him. Then he looked at the open banker's box on the shelf beside Daniel, and the stack of folders that had been shifted to make room for Daniel's work. The expression on Hennessy's face settled into something that was not going to be talked around. Step away from the shelving. Daniel stepped away. He kept his body easy. His hand with the phone stayed at his side. Give me the phone. I don't think I will, Daniel said. The conversation that followed was brief. Hennessy had a radio. He reached for it. Daniel moved first, not violently. Not with force that could be called assault, but with the economical swiftness of someone whose body remembered things his civilian life had tried to soften. He had Hennessy's wrist, and the radio was on the floor, and they were standing 2 feet apart, Hennessy breathing hard, before either of them had spoken again. I'm going to walk out of this room, Daniel said. Nothing else needs to happen. Hennessy was not a man who responded well to calmness. His face reddened. You're done. You understand? I'm calling security, and you're done. That's your right. He walked out. He had 16 photographs on his phone, and a very short window before the building manager made his calls. He called Vanessa at 11 p.m. from the parking structure across the street. She answered on the second ring. He heard background noise. She was still in the building. Hennessy found me in the archive. A pause. Are you safe? He noted the priority of the question. I have the photographs. All of it. I'm sending them to your secure email. Now, Daniel. Her voice was carefully level. What did he see? Enough. He'll go to the board tonight. You have until morning before they lock down your access. He paused. Possibly less. He heard her breathe. Can you file tonight? He asked. The SEC has an emergency hotline for material securities violations. I'd need to compress the submission. It won't be clean. Clean enough? If the documents you photographed are what I think they are, yes. Send me your secure address. He sent the photographs, all 16 of them, taken with the careful eye of someone who had spent years producing documentation under field conditions where accuracy was the difference between actionable intelligence and wasted effort. He had held the phone level, kept the light consistent, made sure every page was complete in the frame. It was not elegant work, but it was thorough. He sat in his car in the parking structure and watched the 42nd floor of Callaway Tower and thought about Sophie, who would be up at 7, who would want to tell him about bridges over breakfast. He thought about the lease renewal and the $20 a night to Mrs. Caldwell. He thought about Roy Hennessy on the phone to whoever he was calling. He thought about what Hennessy's face had looked like in the archive doorway. Not surprise, but satisfaction. A man who had been waiting for a specific thing and had seen it arrive, which meant Hennessy had been watching the archive, or watching Daniel, or both, and that implied a level of surveillance and preparation that made the board's response tonight less a reaction and more a continuation. He thought, they've been ready for this. Then, but so has she. He thought, this is the moment, not the safe, not the archive. This, he could still pull back. He had taken photographs of documents he had no legal authority to access. He had physically restrained a man with building authority. He was sitting in a car outside a corporation whose board was now aware of him. He had given a USB drive to a woman he had spoken to for a total of perhaps 40 minutes. He was a contract cleaning employee with a daughter and a $400 savings account and no particular standing in any of this. The practical inventory of his vulnerability was not short. But vulnerability, he had learned, was not the same thing as helplessness. You could be in a weak position and still make a decision that was right. The weakness didn't invalidate the decision. It just made the cost more visible. He had been in weaker positions than this, and had made decisions he didn't regret. He had been in stronger positions, and made decisions that still sat poorly years later. Position was not the point. He waited. At 1:17 a.m. his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Filed. He drove home. He checked on Sophie. He sat in the kitchen and ate the leftover macaroni from dinner and felt, more than anything else, very tired and very awake. At the same time, the particular state of a person who has done something irreversible and is now waiting to find out whether it was right. He washed the bowl. He put it in the drying rack. He turned out the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment before going to bed. He slept. He was terminated by text at 6:44 a.m. Friday morning. The message was from the facility management company that contracted his employer. Unauthorized access to restricted areas. Conduct inconsistent with building security protocols. Effective immediately. His final check would be mailed. He read it at the kitchen table while Sophie ate cereal. He read it twice, then put his phone face down. Dad. Yeah. Your face is doing the thing again. He looked at her. She was watching him with the patient attention of someone who understood that certain answers required preparation. I lost my job, he said. She put down her spoon. Why? Because I did something that the people who run that building didn't want done. Was it right? He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, bowl of cereal, bridge book stacked at the end of the table. I think so, he said. I won't know for a while. She picked up her spoon. Okay, she said, and went back to eating with a simplicity that he found, in that moment, almost unbearable to witness. By noon, the story had been picked up by 2 financial news outlets. By 3, the SEC had issued a statement confirming receipt of a formal complaint related to Callaway Group and indicating that preliminary review suggested material regulatory concerns. By 5, the 3 board members named in Vanessa Holt's submission had released statements through their attorneys. The silver-haired man, whose name was Bernard Calloway Jr., the founding CEO's son, had retained a crisis communications firm. Curtis Webb had not yet been reached for comment. The board's emergency session on Monday was postponed, then canceled, then restructured, as 3 of its 7 members announced they would be stepping back during the review period. Vanessa Holt issued one statement, 37 words long, that said she would continue to serve as chief executive and cooperate fully with regulators, and that she had nothing further to add at this time. Daniel read all of this on his phone, while sitting on the floor of his apartment, his back against the couch, Sophie at the table doing homework. The news moved fast, and then faster. He watched his name appear twice in a financial blog post, Daniel Marsh, a contracted building services employee, and then disappear behind a paywall. A neighbor texted him a screenshot. He looked at it for a moment, and then set it aside. He did not feel like the protagonist of anything. He felt like a person who had made a series of decisions and now existed on the other side of them. The decisions were done. What came next would arrive at its own pace, and there was nothing to be gained by watching it approach. He did feel, however, something close to what he imagined was meant by the word rightness, not triumph, nothing so elevated. Just the quiet sense of having been in the correct place and done the correct thing, without the outcome having been guaranteed. He had been a soldier long enough to understand that correct decisions did not guarantee good outcomes. The world was not arranged that way. You could do everything right and still have it go badly, and the only defense against the despair of that was to decouple the decision from the result, to make choices based on what they were rather than what they might produce. That had always seemed to him the only version of rightness that meant anything. "Dad," Sophie said from the table. "Yeah. Can you check my math?" He got up off the floor. He sat next to her at the table and looked at her calculations, something about span ratios, penciled in the tight, careful hand she had recently developed as an alternative to her earlier loose sprawl. He checked her math. She was right. He told her so. "I know," she said. "I just wanted you to look at it." He looked at her. "You seemed like you needed something to do," she said. He didn't say anything. He put his hand briefly on the top of her head, the small weight of it, the warmth. And then he got up to start dinner. She came to his apartment on a Saturday, 11 days after the filing. He answered the door in a sweatshirt and found her standing in the hallway in a coat that was not the charcoal one he remembered. This one was lighter, and she was not wearing the expression he associated with the 42nd floor. She looked, in the fluorescent light of his building's corridor, like a person who had slept recently and was still adjusting to the unfamiliar sensation. "You found me," he said. "Building management had your address on file." A pause. "I asked the new building manager. The previous one is currently explaining himself to a grand jury." He stepped back from the door. She came in and stopped in the living room. Sophie was at the table with the bridge books, working on something involving pencil and graph paper. She looked up. "Hi," Sophie said. "Hello." Vanessa looked at her, then at the books. "Are those about bridges?" "I'm designing one," Sophie said. "It goes across the Cuyahoga River. I don't know if it's structurally sound, but the math is mostly right." "What kind of bridge?" "Cable stayed. The tension distribution is more elegant than suspension." Vanessa looked at Sophie for a long moment. "Do you know what a load path is?" Sophie's expression sharpened into the particular attention she reserved for questions that required real answers. "Tell me." Daniel went to the kitchen and made coffee, and listened to the two of them talk about load paths and anchor points, and the ratio of span to tower height. He did not hurry. He made the coffee carefully, the way he did everything carefully, and set 2 mugs on the kitchen table, and went to the doorway, and waited until there was a pause. Sophie noticed first. She looked at her graph paper and then at him. "She knows a lot. I noticed. Are you friends?" Daniel looked at Vanessa Holt. Vanessa Holt looked at Daniel Marsh. "We're getting there," Vanessa said. Sophie accepted this with the shrug of someone for whom friendship was a self-evident good and returned to her drawing. They sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee, and Vanessa said what she had come to say, which was not one thing but several, and she said all of them in the precise way she said most things, without ornamentation. She said, the regulatory process would take months, possibly longer, and there was no guarantee of outcome, but the structure of the complaint was sound, and she had real counsel now, and she was not going into it alone. She said she intended to remain as CEO, because leaving would suggest wrongdoing she had not committed, and because there was work to be done that she was in fact the right person to do. She said, Roy Hennessy had told investigators that Daniel had physically restrained him, and that this claim was being reviewed, and that she had submitted a statement on Daniel's behalf and would continue to do so. She said she had a position available, reporting directly to her, overseeing internal operations, review auditing physical and digital security practices, managing facility protocols, ensuring that the structural conditions that had allowed the preceding year's misconduct to go undetected were systematically identified and corrected. It paid $87,000 a year. It required someone who was methodical, discreet, and not susceptible to the ordinary pressures of corporate hierarchy. She slid a piece of paper across the table. He looked at it. He looked at her. This is a job description, he said. It's an offer. She held his look. I had it drafted 3 days ago. I waited because I wanted to be sure the terms were right, and because I thought you might need time to decide. You could have sent this. I could have. She wrapped her hands around her mug. I thought you deserved to be asked in person. He read the paper. He read it carefully, the way he read everything without haste, giving each line its weight. From the living room, Sophie called, Dad, can I use the ruler? Top drawer. Kitchen. She appeared in the doorway, located the ruler, looked at both of them with the brief, assessing gaze of a child who has learned to read rooms, and went back to her bridge. She's remarkable, Vanessa said quietly. She is. Daniel set the paper down. The job. Is it real? Or is it a gesture? Everything I do is real, she said. I don't make gestures. He believed her. He had believed her since the moment she sat down in her office and decided to stop lying by omission and say out loud what she had been doing. That quality, the willingness to simply speak clearly rather than manage, was rarer than the title on her door. I'll need a week, he said. You have a week. He walked her to the door. She buttoned her coat and looked, in the hallway light. Briefly like the woman he had seen in the car far below, not broken, not diminished, but carrying something heavy with a patience that suggested she was accustomed to the weight. Vanessa. She turned. The night I opened the safe, I didn't decide to help you. I decided to not do nothing. Those are different things. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. That's why I'm here. She walked to the elevator. He stood in the doorway until the doors closed. Epilogue. 6 months later, Sophie's bridge design revised, matured through 6 iterations and 2 consultations with a retired civil engineer who taught at the community college and who had agreed to look at her work after Vanessa had mentioned her to a colleague, was submitted to a regional student design competition. It did not win. It placed 3rd in the structural engineering category, which the judge's notes described as demonstrating unusual conceptual sophistication for a student at this level. Sophie read the notes twice and said, I'll fix the load path on the central span, and went back to her graph paper. Daniel was present for this. He was home in the evenings now. The work was not glamorous. He audited access logs, reviewed vendor contracts, interviewed facility staff, wrote reports that were dense with detail, and conclusions that Vanessa's compliance team implemented in ways that were visible only in the aggregate tighter protocols, cleaner separation between physical and administrative authority, a vendor relationship structure that made certain kinds of quiet arrangement structurally impossible. He was good at it. He had known he would be, not from arrogance, but from the recognition that the skills required pattern recognition, methodical attention, the willingness to ask the plain question, and wait for the real answer, the ability to move through a space without disturbing it, were skills he had been building for most of his adult life, without a professional context that could use them. The skill set was not so different from what he had done in uniform, and not so different, for that matter, from what he had done on the 42nd floor in the small hours of the morning, looking at things other people had looked past, and deciding what they meant. The Callaway Group regulatory review moved at the pace such things move, which is to say, slowly, and with the friction of institutional caution and legal maneuvering, and the particular resistance of people with resources and lawyers who understood how to make processes last longer than anyone wanted. Bernard Callaway, Jr. had issued 3 public statements, each more moderate in tone than the last, a familiar pattern of managed retreat. Curtis Webb had hired counsel and declined to comment on anything. Vanessa did not discuss the case details with Daniel. He did not ask. They both understood the value of clean lines. He and Vanessa spoke daily in work contexts and occasionally in others. They had coffee twice, once at a place near the office, once at the apartment, when she came to deliver a document she could have emailed. Neither of them named what that was. They were both, he suspected, people who moved carefully toward things that mattered, and in no particular hurry. And he found he did not mind the pace. There was something honest in it, the refusal to perform a version of closeness that hadn't been earned yet. Mrs. Caldwell still came on evenings when he worked late. Sophie still had too many books in her backpack. The lease had been renewed for 2 years. He had transferred $200 to the savings account, which now held $612, and he had not calculated the margin column in a month because the margin no longer required monitoring with the same constancy. On a Thursday in November, Daniel was walking through the building's basement-level Old Habit. The quiet hour before the crew arrived, when he passed the archive on sub-level 2, the door was properly secured. The keypad had been upgraded. The access log was now monitored and audited monthly by his office. He stood at the door for a moment. He thought about the night he had stood in a different room and looked at a photograph of a man with a red X on his face, and chosen to do something with what he saw rather than nothing. He had not opened the safe because he was brave. He had not opened it because he knew what was inside. He had opened it because his daughter's voice in his head was asking a question he couldn't answer without looking. And having looked, he had been unable to unknow what he knew. And being unable to unknow it, had been unable to set it down. That was the whole of it. Not heroism. Not calculation. Just the simple, persistent inability of a man with a particular kind of attention to pretend he hadn't seen what was in front of him. He walked on. The building was quiet and ordinary and his, in the only sense that mattered. He understood it, and it had work that needed doing. That was enough.